War Machine presents Leadership Failure, the Battle of Kasserine Pass. Most discussions of the Battle of Kasserine Pass frame it as a simple story of American inexperience versus German professionalism. Green American troops, green American commanders, caught off guard by the Desert Fox, a bloody but necessary baptism by fire. That narrative is comfortable. It implies that the problem was a lack of time, a lack of combat reps, but it's also dangerously misleading. It glosses over the fact that the defeat at Kasserine was not primarily a failure of the individual soldier, but a systemic collapse caused by specific, avoidable decisions made by men far from the front lines. The real story isn't that the Americans were naive. It's that their own leadership structure ensured they would be led into a slaughter. The deeper, less comfortable truth is that Kasserine Pass represents a case study in how doctrine, personality, and a fractured command culture can paralyze an army before the first shot is even fired. It wasn't just a defeat, it was a near-total breakdown of the ability to wage modern warfare. And the lessons learned there would echo through every major campaign the United States would fight for the rest of the century. To understand why the American Second Corps was so vulnerable in February of 1943, you have to look at the strategic gamble that put them there. Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, was a compromise, a British-led strategy to strike at the periphery of Hitler's empire, much to the chagrin of American generals who wanted a direct assault on France. This compromise created a rushed secondary front where the primary objective was speed, get to Tunis before the Axis could reinforce. This rush for terrain came at the expense of logistical stability and, more importantly, cohesive unit training. The United States 1st Armored Division, the main American formation, was not fed into battle as a united division. It was broken up into piecemeal combat commands, scattered across a 50-mile front to hold a series of mountain passes. This was doctrine dictated by geography, not by the tactical reality of how the German army fought. The man responsible for this disposition was Major General Lloyd Friedendall, commander of Second Corps. And it is here, in the decisions of Friedendall, that we find the first critical layer of failure that is often overlooked. Friedendall is frequently caricatured as simply incompetent, but his specific failures are instructive for anyone studying leadership under pressure. He did not trust his subordinates, and he did not trust the terrain. Instead of positioning his headquarters near the front to establish situational awareness, he dug his command post into a ravine nearly 70 miles behind the front lines, near to Besser. He ran the battle by radio and map, issuing orders that were often so detailed they became absurd. In one famous instance, he ordered an infantry battalion to occupy a hill he had named from a map, only for the troops to discover the hill did not exist in the way he imagined. More critically, he failed to conduct a personal reconnaissance of the Kasserine Pass and the Fide Pass area. If he had, he would have seen that his dispositions were a disaster waiting to happen. He placed his forces on the low ground between key mountain features, gifting the high ground, the observation and fields of fire, to the enemy. He assumed the mountains were tank-proof, a fatal misreading of the terrain that the German 10th and 21st Panzer divisions would ruthlessly exploit. This was not just a tactical error, it was a failure of command presence. He created an environment where he was an abstraction to his own men, a voice on the radio ordering them to hold ground he had never seen, against an enemy he had never fought. The consequences of this leadership vacuum were felt most acutely by the infantry and armor crews who were expected to hold the line at places like Sidi Bouzid and the Kasserine Pass itself. The condition of these units reveals a logistical and personnel system stretched to its breaking point. Consider the example of the 168th Infantry Regiment, which was tasked with defending the high ground near Sidi Bouzid. Just days before the German offensive, they received 450 new replacements. These were not just inexperienced soldiers. Many of them had never completed basic training, and some reportedly lacked rifles. They were expected to defend strategic terrain against the Afrika Korps with equipment they had never fired. On February 12th, just 2 days before the attack, the regiment received its first shipment of a new weapon, the M1 bazooka. Soldiers were taught how to use it against German armor on February 14th, the same day the panzers rolled over their positions. This wasn't a failure of courage, it was a failure of preparation. The American soldier was asked to be a combat veteran on the job, learning combined arms warfare in real time against an enemy that had been perfecting it for 3 years. The ground-level chaos was mirrored and, honestly, amplified by a command architecture that was a model of inefficiency. The Allied forces were a polyglot mix of American, British and French units, but there was no unified operational plan. Fredendall reported to the British Lieutenant General Kenneth Anderson, whose First Army was the higher headquarters. This meant an American corps was being fed into a critical sector by a British general who had his own national priorities and, frankly, a deep-seated, often condescending belief in American inexperience. This friction delayed responses and diluted authority. Perhaps the most significant doctrinal failure, however, was in the air. Before Kasserine, air power was treated as an auxiliary to the ground forces, parceled out to support specific units under the doctrine of FM 31-35. This meant there was no centralized control to achieve air superiority. When Rommel struck, American airfields were overrun and aircraft were destroyed on the ground because there was no single air commander with the authority to concentrate assets where they were most needed. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, operated with a unified purpose, bombing the Americans in the pass, while the panzers maneuvered below. The paralysis of American air support was not just a technical failure. It was a direct result of a pre-war doctrine that refused to recognize air power as an independent, co-equal arm. World War II proved that without control of the sky, every movement on the ground becomes a potential ambush. When the German offensive Operation Morgenluft finally slammed into the passes on February 19th, the American defenses crumbled with shocking speed. At Sidi Bou Zid, the isolated American forces were encircled and destroyed by Rommel's classic tactics. At Kasserine itself, the infantry, lacking mutual support and clear orders, broke and ran under the combination of dive bombers and panzer grenadiers. Hundreds of vehicles were abandoned, clogging the roads to the rear. It was a rout. But within this collapse lies a critical, often overlooked lesson about what actually stopped the German advance. It was not a heroic infantry stand, it was the artillery. As the front dissolved, American artillery units, particularly the 9th Infantry Division's artillery battalions who had just completed an 800-mile road march, moved into action. At a key road junction near Thala, they did what the infantry could not. They stood fast. Massing their fire, they created a wall of steel that broke up the German armored thrusts. Rommel's forces, low on fuel and facing this sudden, unbreakable wall of shell fire, realized the moment had passed. The German tanks, which had sliced through the American lines with ease, could not advance against well-coordinated, massed artillery firing over open sights. The infantry had failed. The armor had been outmatched, but the artillery, the branch that had trained seriously and maintained its cohesion, saved the Allied cause from total catastrophe. The Axis withdrawal on February 23rd was a tactical retreat, but the strategic consequences of Kasserine were entirely different. While the battle cost the Americans over 6,000 casualties, the Germans lost irreplaceable men and equipment they could not afford. But for the US Army, the real victory came in the weeks that followed. The debacle at Kasserine acted as a catalyst for radical change. Fredendall was relieved, and men like George Patton and Omar Bradley took command, instilling a culture of discipline and forward presence. But more importantly, the institutional army learned. The broken command structure was overhauled. Within months, the US Army published Field Manual 100-20. a document sometimes called the Declaration of Independence for Air Power, which mandated centralized control of air assets and established the principle of air superiority as a prerequisite for ground operations. The piecemeal deployment of armor was discarded in favor of massed, combined arms tactics. The soldier who arrived with a rifle and no training was replaced by a system that understood the cost of sending unprepared men into battle. The lessons of Kasserine were written in blood, but they were applied with ink, transforming the US Army from a hesitant novice into the force that would storm Normandy 15 months later. The Battle of Kasserine Pass matters not because it was America's first defeat, but because it reveals the anatomy of failure itself. It shows us that an army is not just a collection of men with guns. It is a system of thought, a structure of leadership, and a set of doctrines. When that system is poisoned by poor leadership, fractured command, and contempt for the enemy, the soldier on the ground pays the price. Understanding Kasserine means understanding that survival, whether on a battlefield or in any high-stakes environment, depends on honest assessment, unified command, and leaders who are willing to see the ground for themselves. It is a reminder that the cost of arrogance is always paid in blood, and that the only way to earn the title of veteran is to survive the mistakes of the novice. If you value this kind of in-depth historical analysis, one that looks beyond the medals and the maps to the hard truths of leadership and survival, make sure you subscribe to War Machina. Hit that subscribe button and share this video with anyone who understands that history's real value lies in the lessons we're willing to learn.